The second question is equally fundamental, and that is this system stable economically? Or is it, as I suggested earlier, so prone to booms and busts and financial crises that whatever benefits we have realized by globalization over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years may be undone or even overwhelmed? It may be that the cross-border flow of goods, services, people, information, and money is now so great that this international integration has really swamped our capacity to understand it. Economies adjust in two ways. They adjust through the market, and they adjust through government actions, government policies. And in the international sphere, both of these are weaker than they are domestically. So if you think about how a self-contained American economy would adjust to something, supposing it's in economy's in recession because housing prices have got too high and people can't afford them anymore, and the people who thought they could afford them begin to default on their loans, something like it's going on right now. How would the economy recover? Well, the first thing that would happen is housing prices would begin to come down. And sooner or later, they would get to a point where people who could not afford them before or did not think it worth the price before would begin to buy. And you would clear out the inventory of unsold homes, and you would begin to buy more new homes, and construction would revive, and the economy, which had gone into a recession because of this housing slump, would begin to recover. So that's the way a market mechanism works. If people become, or companies become, over-indebted, they stop spending money, they begin to pay off their loans. That slows the economy down because spending is what keeps it going. But sooner or later, people have paid down their debts enough so that they feel comfortable with the remaining debt burden, and they begin spending, and the economy recovers. Now, what may help this process along is the government. The government may, through its central bank, in our case the Federal Reserve, lower interest rates, or to kind of help the economy get out of a recession. But in the world economy, these mechanisms are not nearly as powerful, either the mechanisms of government or the mechanisms of the market. Let me just take a specific example of the market mechanism. We have these huge trade imbalances today, that the United States has these huge trade deficits, and other countries, China, Japan, have huge trade surpluses. There is a fear, well-grounded in my view, that these imbalances may be unsustainable, that at some point it simply will be impossible for the countries that have become used to exporting to the United States to increase their exports, and Americans won't want to buy more exports. We may be at that point right now. In a well-functioning market, this process would have not gone to where it is today. Exchange rates, that's to say the value of currencies, would have changed in such a way to prevent these huge imbalances from accumulating. A surplus country, that is a country that's exporting more than its import, its currency would appreciate. That would make its exports more expensive on world markets, and its imports into that country cheaper. And so its trade surplus would tend to diminish because it would be less able to export and be more advantageous to import. At the same time, the country with a huge deficit, in this case the United States, would have its currency depreciate. Our exports would become cheaper on world markets, imports would become more expensive, we would tend to export more, import less, our deficit would shrink. That is one way in which a market reaction would help correct an imbalance and a potential instability in the world economy. That has not really happened, and it has not happened for two reasons. One, the countries that have these surpluses don't want it to happen, and so they've manipulated their exchange rates to keep them artificially low and to maintain their export advantage. And the other reason is that the dollar is the central world currency. It's the currency that people prefer to hold more than any other, although that may change in the future. And so that the extra demand for dollars tends to keep its value somewhat higher than it would otherwise be. So this market mechanism is weakened in the world economy. It still exists, but it's not as strong as it would be in some national economies, at least our national economy. Now, and then if you ask yourself, well, what are the comparable institutions, what are the comparable ways the world could embark on collective government actions that would substitute for the government actions in the nation? Well, there really is no world central bank. There is no Federal Reserve for the world. We do have an International Monetary Fund, but without going into details over how it operates, it's not the economic equivalent of a central bank. It cannot raise and lower world interest rates. Neither can the World Bank, although its name implies that that's what it does. So we don't have a central bank. We obviously don't have a world government that can raise or lower taxes, that can increase or decrease spending depending on the needs of the world business cycle. So these institutions also are much weaker than would exist in a national economy. We are now in this crisis, this global financial and economic crisis. And in my view, this is really a testing moment for whether or not we can manage this world economy in a way that limits its downside and maximizes its potential benefits. And I don't want to be, and I think the jury is out on what's going to happen here. The world economy, globalization, whatever you want to call it, is a work in progress. It's not, today it's different from what it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago it was different from what it was 10 years before that. In 10 years from now, it'll be different for better or for worse than it is today. So the question is, how will we cope in the current crisis? And what we are seeing today is we do see a fair amount of cooperation. We don't see world government, but we do see national central banks basically doing the same thing, which is lowering interest rates in an attempt to stimulate the world economy. And you do see these governments coming together and having big meetings and issuing communiques in which they all pledge to cooperate and to have economic stimulus programs, in other words, either to spend more or tax less to try to stimulate their economies in a way that might be similar to an international regime, but is not identical to it. Will this work, or is this just PR? That is really the question of the moment, and I don't know the answer. I don't think anybody else knows the answer, and on that confession of ignorance, I will end and open myself up to Q&A. If anybody has a Q, maybe I will have an A.